So let's get started. A little orientation first again.
Under normal light.
So here we have another view from the top of a larynx. The vocal folds are, in this case, vibrating, as Bob said, faster than the fusion frequency of the eye, so it's hard to see the vibration. Back here is the opening of the posterior glottis in this particular patient. The vocal process is about where that forefinger is right there. And you can see a little crescent, and then if you don't move that forefinger, it goes away a little bit. Then you see a little crescent usually. That's the vocal process tip, which is probably the most important landmark in the larynx, because when the two vocal folds come together, you want those 2 points to be as close together as possible. Here's the left outline of the medial portion of the false vocal fold or ventricular fold. Here's the right side. The stark shade here suggests to me that the ventricle is the shape that goes down rather than straight across or up, but you can have all three. Then we have over here the outline that was basically shown before, the thin epithelium. The superficial layer of the lamina propria is very flexible, and then you have these two layers, the intermediate and deep, that form the vocal ligament. So let's talk about some very basic parameters of variables that we control when we are speaking or singing. Fundamental frequency is first. This is an illustration again of one cycle where the vocal folds are together. The vocal folds separate and then reach a maximum. When the vocal folds are separating, we say this is glottal opening. When the vocal folds then come back toward each other, this is called glottal closing. And then there's a third phase called the closed glottis. This is one cycle. In my voice right now, if I say, that's about 199 hertz or something, and so say it's 100 hertz, that means it's the vocal folds are opening, closing 100 times per second. If you take the amount of time it takes for one of those cycles, it's called a period. And if you calculate that in seconds, like if the period of one of my cycles is 1/100th of a second, you inverse that number and you get 100, and that is the frequency then of my fundamental frequency. So to again illustrate that, here is the vibratory action where you can see the
we can evaluate fundamental.
You can see the opening and closing like as illustrated. In fact, this illustration, believe it or not, from Ronald and his student, this illustration comes from this video that they made. And then over yonder here in this particular video, which is available actually through the Voice Foundation, has these different portions of that cycle. So again, one cycle, you take the time, invert that, you have the fundamental frequency. As has been discussed earlier, the cricothyroid muscle goes from the cricoid cartilage to the thyroid cartilage, and as you contract that, the cricoid rises and extends the vocal fold back, in an illustration I'll show you in a second. This is antagonistic to the vocalis muscle that runs just to the inside of the lamina propria. And so these are antagonistic muscles. In speech, in the clinic, in training of singers, in knowing what the control factors are, you have to, I would suggest, strongly talk and think about antagonistic muscle groups. Because when antagonistic muscles, when they fire, they are to be moving a structure or themselves. You always have to say, when you have antagonistic muscles, what is it that they are antagonistic about? So Johan was talking about antagonistic muscles that actually changed the rib cage separation, which changed the lung volume. So you can talk about either the rib cage size or the size of the lung volume, as well as the diaphragm and the abdominal muscles. Those are antagonistic for lung volume. So in all of our pedagogy, in all of our teaching, and all of our research, the antagonistic action is important, especially in tension cases where the antagonistic action is strong and you have to relax that for a better technique. Anyway, getting back now to fundamental frequency, when the cricothyroid muscle down here is not firing very much, the vocal folds are relatively short. But then when the cricothyroid muscle contracts more, the cricoid moves up, pivoting on the cricothyroid joint right here. Because the arytenoids are on top there, this will elongate the vocal folds because they are attached in front here near the thyroid cartilage and back here near the vocal process. Also, here, let's look at this. This would be pitch change. So you can see that as the vocal folds elongate, the pitch goes up. And the question there is, well, why does that happen? Dr. Sadloff touched on this, and we will in just a second as well. But we'll preface by saying, well, the tension actually, the natural tension of stretched tissue, like a rubber band, is going up fairly fast as you elongate the folds. And that actually raises the fundamental frequency. But first, I want to show you this. This is a contour or outline of the medial surface of the vocal fold. For very low pitches, when the vocal folds are quite short, the glottis, which the vertical extent of the glottis from the cursor there down to here, and I'm not moving it very smoothly. See that? There you go. That's fairly long for the very low frequencies because the vocal fold is thick here. But as you raise the fundamental frequency, because the vocal folds are elongating, it's like a rubber band. If you, as you know, if you elongate that, it gets longer, but it gets thinner. And the vocal fold basically is preserving its volume. So you have a new contour with a higher pitch. This would be a higher pitch than that lowest pitch. And then if you go into, say, falsetto, very high pitch, you can actually just get this portion here that is the edge, and you have this shape here because it's elongated. So the basic string equation actually is very insightful for us to understand this change in fundamental frequency when the vocal folds get longer. The fundamental frequency is defined here as 1 over 2 times the length of the tissue in motion, and then times the square root here, T. T is the just natural physical tension of the tissue in motion, and below that is density, rho, which doesn't really change. So what happens as the vocal folds elongate, like in that last illustration, the length is increasing, but the tension of the tissue in motion is increasing much faster, and thus this whole number here is getting, higher, and thus the fundamental frequency is higher. The vocal folds are moving back and forth faster because they're more tense. For those of us who worry about edema, laryngitis, etc., it's a good idea from a basic thinking point of view to transform these terms into a force and a length and a mass by these little expressions over here. What's nice about this expression, which is kind of equivalent to define what the fundamental frequency might be, the force here can be thought of as the force created by the cricothyroid muscle to lengthen. So it's like the pulling force on the vocal fold. But here what's really nice is you have the mass of the motion, of the tissue that's in motion. And with laryngitis, with edema, the fundamental frequency goes down, doesn't it, when you have edematous vocal folds. And the force doesn't necessarily change, the length doesn't necessarily change. But if you double the mass here, you will definitely lower the fundamental frequency. So you could actually, if you're clever, you could actually measure about how much mass increase there is for your patient if you have the before and after frequency, which is kind of cool. So, Another aspect of fundamental frequency is registers, the basic registers for speech or vocal fry, gesture modal, and falsetto. Obviously, in this room, we talk a lot about head registers, mixed registers, etc. But let's take a gander at some basic registers here. First will be vocal fry, where the vocal folds are quite short and highly adducted here as well. Try to strobe fry, that's a trick. So that's fry, and then chest register, this is a beautiful illustration of mucosal wave. Vocal folds are longer, and then you can see that nice mucosal wave over the entire medial portion. Then falsetto has a very similar vibration, but it's only in the top like 1 millimeter or so of the duct there of the tissue. Okay, cool, huh? So the next variable that is very basic in phonation is adduction. Dr. Sadaloff was talking about the adductory aspects of the arytenoid cartilages on the cricoid cartilage. The two primary motions, rocking motion, is where the arytenoid here that's sitting on this cricoid is going to rock down and in like this cylinder here and this semicircular thing here. So the motion actually is to rock down and in. So if you think about the vocal processes, when this rocking motion takes place, the vocal processes which want to come together right at the here, so the vocal folds are nicely put together at the same plane, vertical plane, things like that. They're going in, forward, and down. The other aspect is a gliding motion. During adduction from breathing, this arytenoid glides or slides up the facet. And so if my hand here is the bottom portion of the arytenoid, and this is the cricoid cartilage, that motion is up and in and back a little bit. So if you combine these two motions of rocking down and in and gliding up and in, if you look at the vocal processes, here is vocal process here and there, what happens is they kind of compensate for each other. As they're coming down and in, they're also going up and in. So the vocal processes actually just kind of come across, and that's why you don't see much vertical motion. The folds just kind of come over near each other, like almost on the same plane, because they're compensating for each other vertically. Okay, see that? There's also some rotational aspects to any joint, but those are the two primary ones. Also part of adduction is this breathy to normal to pressed. You can't phonate unless you're in the phonatory adductory range. In this illustration A, the vocal folds are maximally separated, and in B here, they are close enough where you have the breathy boundary for this particular larynx. That sound would be something like, where the adduction is just enough to create breathiness. If you look at the distance between the two vocal processes, which we call the vocal process gap, that is 14% of the range in this illustration here for this particular subject. Then there's a normal breathy quality boundary, a pressed normal boundary, and then beyond that you again have a phonic situation, meaning that you can't phonate. So in fact, when you talk about how to stop phonation, you can adduct beyond the phonatory adductory range, or you can adduct so much that you go the other direction in hyperadduction beyond the phonatory adductory range. Those, relative to adduction, those are the two. And by the way, once you know about that setup, you hear it all the time. Well, that's adducting. Well, I don't know, that's adducting. And you hear it also in singers. They will adopt those two strategies. Oh, so this will be cool. You'll like this. qualities will now be demonstrated. If I talk in a very breathy manner, such as this, you can notice that the space between the two vocal folds is slightly open toward the top of the slip. Oh, thanks. But the good news is, with the new way of doing this, we can go right down. You can notice that the space between the two vocal folds is slightly open toward the top of the slip. Right here. When this happens, air escapes, and you get the breathy sound. The folds are just barely touching. If I press the larynx too firmly together like this, then the structures are pressed together and you get that pressed sound. And if I talk normally, they are not so pressed together. Cool, huh? So, the press thing will be tiring. The next aspect that I want to talk about is subglottal and interglottal air pressures relative to vocal fold motion and relative to glottal airflow. So, subglottal pressure is discussed really nicely by Johan earlier today. So if you want to create subglottal pressure, you first basically usually inhale some air, that would be good. And you want to set the level of adduction typically to the pressed or normal or breathy kind of quality that you want. And then you have the next aspect of applying the relaxation pressure, which earlier today was called what's the word? Elasticity. The elastic recoil of the system. So sometimes it's called relaxation pressure that's created by that elasticity. So you apply relaxation pressure because at certain lung volumes, that's you're going to have a certain amount of that, and also muscle forces to reduce the volume of the lung. So those are the muscle forces of the torso. So you have the relaxation pressure and those muscle forces. Then that's how you're going to be creating subglottal pressure. So when will phonation happen? If the vocal folds are close enough, like we just talked about, and those forces are high enough, this creates enough subglottal air pressure to make the vocal folds move, that is, set them into oscillation or vibration. We have this concept which is clinically important and production and even studio important. What's the lowest subglottal pressure to cause phonation? And that's called the Phonetic threshold pressure. And it's around 3 centimeters of water for the lower pitches. And then, as Dr. Satelov was saying, as you increase the pitch of the voice, the vocal folds elongate and they become a little more tense. And it takes a little bit more pressure to get those to go into motion and stay in motion. So the Phonatory threshold pressure typically increases with the pitch of the voice. So the subglottal pressure is dependent upon the level of glottal adduction, and the amount of force applied to the lungs to reduce its volume. The amount of subglottal pressure and the amount of airflow that also results from that are dependent upon these two factors, adduction and forces to reduce the lung volume. Now we have two kinds of pressure. One is the transglottal pressure at the larynx level, transglottal pressure, and that's actually literally, you take the tracheal air pressure, say 10 centimeters of water, and you subtract from that the pressure above the glottis, which on average is probably around 0 if it's just a vowel. So 10 minus 0 is 10. That's called transglottal pressure, the difference between below and above. But we also have, and that drives the airflow through the hole that's called the glottis. So the transglottal pressure drives airflow through. But we also have pressures in the glottis that's pushing on the vocal folds to push them out and to pull them back in. Those are called intraglottal pressures, to push and pull. So we need to have both of those in mind when we talk about these dynamic pressures. So here we have the first stage of opening, where right before opening, the top of the vocal folds there are touching, and there's no flow between those membranous vocal folds, let's say, but there may be some flow shown by the difference between this baseline of 0 and there, because there may be a posterior glottis opening that gives you a little bit of constant flow, and that's very typical. And then you have the next stage here is when the vocal folds are separating during glottal opening, and they are forming a convergent shape. Now this convergent shape has actually positive pressures pushing the vocal folds away, because the tracheal pressures are positive, and this is wider below and narrower above in the glottis. And thus positive pressures literally are pushing the vocal folds away from each other. Please do not say they're blown apart. That doesn't have the right connotation. Then the vocal folds reach a maximum opening, but that is actually before the maximum flow is coming through the glottis. It's not until the vocal folds are starting to come back toward each other, and now the shape is divergent, and now you have, what's happening now is the maximum flow occurs, but the maximum glottal area has passed. And we call this skewing to the right. That means that the airflow is later, the peak airflow is later than the maximum glottal area. So we call that skew to the right. I'm not sure who invented that. I have to look into that. Where's Johan? I don't know. So it's a delay in why does that happen? The main aspect is inertance of the air. So what's that all about? Inertance has to do with air and mass and stuff like that. So when the vocal folds separate, air comes through the glottis, but it meets its brethren, this whole column of air, and it has to shove that air out. And so there is this delay, which is best described in electronics, actually, to understand that, because otherwise it's pretty hard to understand, actually. And the other aspect is a divergent shape, which is now when the skewing occurs. Divergent shape is actually less resistive to the flow than the same angle convergent. And so that actually also can help skew the flow. And then we have, in a minor way, a squish. When the vocal folds come toward each other, they kind of squish air out because it's divergent, you see, squish. And so that actually adds, but when it's opening, it kind of pulls the air a little bit. But as a minor, it's number 3, not number 1 or 2. So, and that's measurable. Now, when it's divergent, now we have the occurrence of Bernoulli effect. The Bernoulli effect is negative pressure because the Bernoulli equation says so. I can keep this straight. And the only time the Bernoulli effect actually is happening is when the vocal folds are coming back toward each other, and there's this divergent shape. The Bernoulli equation says that now this pressure here, down here in the glottis, has to be lower than the pressure up here. And usually, when this is happening, the pressure up here is average of 0 or even negative, for the next reason I'm going to say. And so this is actually the Bernoulli effect. And it's best seen if the angle, that divergent angle, is not very large. But that's the only time the Bernoulli effect is there. Notice Bernoulli effect is negative pressure inside that tube due to the Bernoulli equation, which happens to be valid all the time, basically. So those negative pressures help to pull the vocal folds toward each other. So you have the Bernoulli equation with the Bernoulli effect at that time, but you also have rarefaction that's helping out to have negative pressures in the glottis. How does that work? So when the vocal folds are coming back toward each other, they are shutting off the flow, right? You're turning your faucet off so there's less flow coming through into your sink. So as the vocal folds are coming together, less flow is coming through. Well, a second ago, this particle was going that fast, but now the particle next in line is going that fast, that is slower, and so now the particles are separating, and as you learned from class a long time ago, or yesterday, that means that there is a negative pressure being created because the molecules are separating. That's called rarefaction, and it's a real term in acoustics. That's a negative pressure. So that rarefaction actually is communicated down into the glottis because it's occurring at the top of the glottis here. And that can be quite strong, especially the louder you are. And there can also be vortical structures that if the angle here is large enough and the flow separates from the wall, you'll have really nice, curly lines of flow, and they can actually add to the negative pressure. Now, however, this is a really important point. The vocal folds have been shoved out. It's like a mass on a spring. They want to recoil back. And the largest force, when the vocal folds are out here, all ready to come back, the largest force is not aerodynamic. The largest force is the recoil of the tissue back. It's only when you get halfway to the end of that coming back is when the aerodynamic stuff kicks in and the recoil is less. So they trade jobs. So here recoil is pulling them back, and then now those pressures are helping to close the glottis at the end of that cycle. So when it's opening, you have positive pressures to push it out, they're pushing the mass on a spring, and then the recoil starts, the aerodynamic pressures are really low, and then they get more and more negative, and they come together, and everybody hopefully is happy. Then, we're just partway through the cycle. As the vocal folds continue to come together, the flow starts to, again, as I said, shut off, and then they will touch, and then there'll be this portion of the glottis is closed. So what's the glottal flow look like? This is so cool. I can't wait to show you. So here is larynx that I have been familiar with for a while, and over here is a larynx that's come from has come from an excised canine from Sid Kostla's lab. So he has allowed me to use this. And so what we have here, we have the arytenoid cartilages, these two specimens. We have the posterior glottis. Notice there's a little hole in both one of those. That's kind of both one of those. What the heck was that? And we have the right vocal fold, we have the left vocal fold, and the glottis is the slit between them. And you got to see this. This, I can't wait. So 513, I'm going to come over here, and this is now, the air is seeded with something, can't remember, and it's backlit. So you can see these puffs of air coming through the glottis during each of those cycles. And so it is more, I don't know if I can control this on-off business. So now it's wide open, and there's a lot of flow coming through, and then it's shutting off, just like we talked about. So, I mean, you can't watch this long enough. So this is really cool. Now notice that as the flow comes out, it actually is creating sound. So why is it creating sound? Sound is created when you have density changes, and density changes is when the particles are moving relatively closer or further apart, or in this case we have a volume velocity that was illustrated in, this top here is a volume velocity. But notice it's the airflow is changing, and it's the changing airflow from one point of view from engineering. It's the changing airflow that is creating the sound. And so in the clinic, in the studio, whether you have a normal larynx, whether you have a pseudolarynx, whether you have a hemilaryngectomy, whether you have esophageal speech, What you really want for adequate sound and the right quality of the source is to have a glottal flow or a quasi, full glottal flow that has an amplitude, a shut-off, etc. that looks something like this, from cycle to cycle being the same. It's the changing airflow that is the source of sound. So it's set up by the transglottal pressure, the motion of the folds, but you get the flow and the sound there. That's a sound source, and then that is going to be changed by the vocal tract above. And what I want to show you is, to end this, another function obviously of the larynx is a cough. And I haven't shown any high speed of the vocal folds, so I thought I would show you this courtesy of Heather. So this is, first of all, the vocal folds and the vocal folds, oh, thank you very much for that. When you cough, obviously there's a lot of adduction, close off of the true folds, false folds, and in this case, other tissue. And as soon as you start to release the cough, the tissue is going to shake, move quite violently, something like that. And thus, if you have a kind of like frog in your throat, this is what you do. But you can tell that a cough is actually quite deleterious because the tissue is flipping around. So there are a lot of internal accelerations, and so there could be a lot of irritation, not from closure, but from the shaking of the cough itself. So, in order to save time, these are the things we talked about. Never the end. Okay, so next up is somebody.
So, can you hear me? Yes, I think you can. Excellent. So, I'm Sten from Stockholm, and I'll be talking now. We've had a lot of nice lectures on what goes on inside, and now I'll be talking a little bit about the sound that comes out. And of course, much of my career, frankly, has been devoted to analysing the sound that comes out, because it's cheaper and less invasive to analyse than sticking expensive instruments down people's throats. And so my challenge, I think, is to try to figure out as much as possible without sticking things down people's throats. So let's see how that works. And in the process, we will be talking about what is a sine wave, what is the harmonic series, what we mean by a spectrum, and the pulse, and the resonance, and the formant. These are all words that you will encounter in the week to come. Okay, so first we have the concept of the sine wave. No doubt you have heard of the sine wave, and the reason that a sine wave is very important is that it's sort of the atom of all tonal sounds. It has a very nice S shape, we'll see that in a moment, and it's actually, if you imagine, the projection of a circle. So if we have a circle that is going around like this and we start moving it in time, then we get the shape of a sine wave. Right, so I'm going to try to make some sounds using sine waves, and let me move. Let's first have a look at this. This is always nervous. Okay, so that's almost the sine wave. Let's go. There we are. Brilliant. Now, can we all see that? Could make it bigger if possible. So this is almost like a sine wave. Or the fact is, if you whistle, you become very close to a sine wave. So there we are. But you can also notice that as I speak, there's much else going on. If I say, ah, that looks a lot more complicated. But actually, it's not, in a way. So let's analyze this using a spectrum. And if I do, you'll notice that this single spike here, now we have frequency on the horizontal axis, and there's only one frequency that really stands out here, and that's the frequency of this sine wave. And if we look at the scale there, it's at about 2,000 cycles per second. And the height of this is the strength of that sine wave. So if we go in an earlier incarnation, I was a tone generator. However, you can all be tone generators, and in fact, you have now the opportunity of seeing yourself whistle on the screen. So I invite you now to whistle, and we'll see what happens. There you go. So, with the magic of technology, we can see that this particular way of analyzing sound is able to resolve many sine waves at the same time, right? And could I have one other person whistle? Ron. There we go. All right. Now, how do we go from here to complicated sound? Well, if I do and I'll freeze that. And we have here the first partial tone, that's a sine wave, and the second partial tone, which is also a sine wave, and so on, the third, fourth, fifth, and so on. And you can see here that in this particular sound, their strengths were all very different. So this is a bit complicated. Let's make things simpler to begin with. So I'm going to resort to my old friend, the synthesizer. So we're going to bring up a little additive synthesizer like this. I'm going to try to reduce the clutter on the screen and switch over to synthesizer mode like that. And now we have a tone like that, and we have a spectrum of that sound there. And we can hear a very nice, stable, pure sine wave. And acousticians love this because it's completely measurable, very stable, it has a well-defined frequency, tra-la-la-la-la. And of course, voices aren't like that. So let's add another partial tone, the second one. And the third. Take them away again, just to spite you a little bit. No, sorry. So I can actually play this with this keyboard here. That's what a lone sine wave sounds like. It's not terribly expressive or informative, but even, as you know, we can whistle and make music out of that, so that's still not bad. So let's add a lot of sine waves. You can see that as I increase the fundamental frequency, the pitch, the spectrum kind of stretches out like that, because the frequency of the first harmonic increases and the frequency of the second harmonic is always twice that, and so that moves along twice as much and 3 times as much, and so on. And at the moment, this synthesizer is set up for a limited number of harmonics, but we could in principle keep adding more and more, like that. except that above 5,000 hertz or so, they don't mean terribly much. Actually, this goes up to 10 kilohertz now, 10,000. Okay, that doesn't sound very vocal or interesting at all. What's the difference? Well, we need to add a bit of resonance to this. And so to illustrate what that is, we're going to talk about that. Let's see. Right, now we've talked about partial tones and harmonics, and there was a very clever Frenchman in the beginning of the 19th century, Jean-Baptiste Fourier, who figured out that any periodic waveform, no matter how complicated it is, can be expressed as a sum of sine waves. And not only that, but a sum of sine waves where the frequencies are all at integer multiples of each other. So if the first partial is at 100 hertz, the second will be at 200, and the third will be at 300, and so on. And that is what we call the harmonic series. And it, among many other things, it sort of lays the foundation for the musical scales that we use nowadays. There we go. All right. Now, let's move on to resonance. And if you were to take the vocal folds, I have here a model of the vocal folds, and of course that's rather like doing this. You can adduct and abduct by doing this. But that's, I mean, that will only get you so far in terms of communication. It does help if we can somehow shape that sound so we can go. And this is what the vocal tract does. It introduces resonances that colour the sound. So if I go and instead put that through a tube, you see, you get a sort of a sound. This is already much more familiar. I mean, some people actually sound like that. And then, of course, what sets it's interesting that all mammals have basically the same mechanism inside here. But what sets us apart from most mammals is that we have better neural control over that machine. And we can move our tongue and lips and jaw more than most of the other mammals. So as we love to make models, I have here a constriction that I can move along the tube, which is a bit like the tongue. If you imagine you just say I, you, Y, you're moving the back of the tongue back or forth in the mouth. So if you go brilliant. So that's what we engineers love. You know, stiff models, not elastic or wet or gooey or the voice is a terrible thing for an engineer, really. Not just because it looks kind of queasy, but it's quite hard to define because you've got nothing really attached to it, anything rigid. Everything is squishy and elastic and dependent on everything else. And this is a very profound insight, actually. If you measure anything about the voice, it is going to change when you change loudness, and it's going to change when you change pitch. And so my firm belief is that whenever we measure things with a voice, we have to do it at many pitches and many loudnesses, or we won't see the landscape, as it were. That's a different story. Okay, thank you to Professor Arai for building these lovely models. And now I will try to demonstrate what resonance is. So there is a procedure to determine whether a given object has resonance, and the first thing is to hit it. So you can hit anything and it will probably display whether it has a resonance or not. For example, let's see, that has a nice sort of a ping sound to it. So we listen, and if it says bong or ping, yes. And if it goes more like thud or a pop, a bit maybe, and if it just goes or click so there's not much resonance at all. Okay, so of course this is a bit sloppy. As an engineer, I would say a formal procedure for characterizing the resonance properties of a given system is to impart an impulse of energy to the system. In other words, hit it. Record the system's response to this impulse. In other words, listen. And then each sinusoidal component of the response, if any, corresponds to a resonance. So let's try this with a tube. And I will first go back to our friend here. And let's see, is this on yet? And now I have to go back to this other patch. There we go. Ah! What fun. And running the spectrum. Okay, so what happens when we hit a tube? I'll try to make this. Can you see? I wish I could freeze this when it was sort of at its height. But you can see that there are several spikes in the spectrum on the right, right? At the low frequencies. And what are they? Well, they are resonances in this tube. And now I thought I think we're going to try to actually measure them a bit more carefully. So we're going to do this, and close this down for the moment, and then run another little handy sort of thing. And so here I have a pair of headphones, and I'm going to play a sine wave to my microphone here. And this is slightly precarious, but let's see if I can do that. I need to switch to the frequency thing there, thank you. And then we'll all be very quiet and see what happens. Okay, so that's without a tube. And when I did this in the hotel room, these crinkles were not there. So these low frequency crinkles are due to the ventilation system in this room, probably. That there is a background noise that we don't hear much of. Okay, now, this is when I need 3 hands, but anyway. I will now play that same sweep through this tube, and we'll compare it to what we just had. There we go. So now you can see that some frequencies get through the tube more strongly than others because they're being helped by the resonance of the tube. And this is, in fact, exactly what happens in the voice as well. So if we go back and we take, let's see, what are we going to do now? We're not going to do that quite yet. Let's see, I want to show you this more in greater detail. So let's go back here and turn on okay, brilliant. So now if I go or let's see, stretch that a bit. We are now in a position to break this down and say that, okay, we know now that these thin spikes are representations of the energy in each of the harmonics, whereas we can see that some are much stronger than others, and that's because they happen to be close in frequency to the resonances of my vocal tract. So remember I did this, and of course I can do the same thing with my vocal tract. And by changing the effective length of my vocal tract, I can change the resonance frequency. So if we look at the figure here, see See the difference between that ringing? Oops. Oh. So this is actually easy to do on the inhale. So I'll do it. And curiously, if we look at the spectrum of that, suddenly the resonance peaks will stand out in all their glory. They're still there if I do and you might wonder, if there are all these dozens of sine waves in the sound, why don't we hear those sine waves? Well, that's because they're all moving in step with each other, and then our brain decides that, oh, these are all in phase, so they're all coming from the same place. But if we had two voices, you would hear that there are two voices, right? Or three voices, you would hear that there is more than two voices at least. So that's all very fascinating. And you can hear harmonics. I'm sure many of you have heard of or even tried overtone singing. Yes? Yes? All right, so did you hear that? Okay, so actually we can hear them if we direct our attention to them and if they are prominent enough. And it's been shown that that our sense of hearing actually doesn't care very much about the weak harmonics because they're kind of masked by the strong harmonics. And we may hear more about that in a moment. Okay, how are we doing for time? We're desperate. 9 minutes. Wow, thank you. All right, great. So what we've learned so far is that there is something called the Harmonic Series of partial tones, and that the sound of, well, actually we haven't looked at that, but we could. Let's see what the spectrum of this is like. Well, you can see that there's a lot of noise, right? And at high frequencies, we can get lots of energy by saying S or something like that. Why don't we see the formant peaks in the S? Well, that's because the noise is being generated after the tube, up at the front of the teeth. Okay? We can still color it a bit by doing there you can see some resonance peaks which come from the little cavity both in front of the teeth and also under the tip of the tongue to some extent. Okay, if I instead say now we can see formant peaks quite clearly because that noise is being generated down near my vocal folds somewhere. And so it has to pass through the resonator, which has these resonant peaks. So there we are. We can now figure out how a tube can color the sound. Now, this of course is a ridiculous simplification. The vocal tract does not look like a cylinder at all, and you will probably see pictures of it in the week to come. In fact, it's sort of, at the top, it's sort of flat and wide between the tongue and the hard palate. And then as it goes back, it sort of narrows down into more of a tube. And at the bottom, just above the vocal folds, it actually comes forward a little bit. So it looks like a sort of a cobra poised to strike. Interesting shape. Okay, now what? We've still got a few minutes, all right. So a single pulse is a one-time event. It's not periodic. But when we repeat it regularly, the waveform becomes periodic. And the fundamental frequency, or FO as we call it, the frequency of oscillation, is the number of repetitions per second. And if the pulses don't repeat exactly, then FO becomes difficult to determine. And this is also one of the key things for people who analyze the voice, because we all have a notion that if there is something wrong with my voice, then the vocal folds are not oscillating very regularly. Or there is some kind of perturbation in my fundamental frequency. And so a huge part of voice analysis is devoted to the quantification of these irregularities. And that's a whole swamp. I mean, the analysis of I've actually applied for a grant just to study different kinds of irregularities. So wish me luck. Now we can summarize this by saying that if we look at the spectrum, that is level versus frequency of the voice source at the vocal folds, it looks very boring. It's the first harmonic is the strongest, and then they come down like that. And then it passes through the resonator, which imparts a number of resonant peaks onto this sound, and what we get out is something that looks rather like that. Okay? Now, it's very tempting to think that the strongest harmonic here, 1, 2, 3 in this case, is at the same frequency as the first formant. But as you can see, that only is not always true, because we can't tell from the spectrum that comes out exactly where the formant is. We just know that it's probably somewhere in the vicinity of this harmonic. And I like to have the image of a picket fence behind which you have strung up a rope on a couple of nails. So the task then is, by looking from the other side of the fence, to tell where are the nails on the back side of the fence. Maybe that's a helpful analogy. Okay, so formant is an acoustic resonance in the vocal tract. And it is so called because it forms or shapes the spectrum of the voice. Not all spectrum peaks are caused by formants, but in voice sounds they usually are. And so a little bit of terminology, a formant and their property, and its properties are like this. The symbol for a formant is capital F followed by a numeral, F1, F2, F3. The symbol for the frequency of the formant is either this, a small f with the F, with the name of the object there. Some people think this is too difficult to write, so they just write slanting F1 like that. And that is the position horizontal-wise of the resonance frequency. These peaks can be of varying strength, and that's if we have some level to relate them to, such as the highest one, we can say that the level of the second formant and third formant are 10 or 27 dB below some other reference point. We also talk sometimes about the bandwidth of the formants, which is how sharp these pointy things are. And that makes a difference. If I have a very pressed voice, then my vocal folds will be closed most of the time, and it will have there will be a large resonance factor to the vocal tract. But if I have a very breathy voice like this, then the open glottis, which is sort of open for a longer part of the time, will leak energy out down into my lungs, and so the resonance will not be so pronounced because some energy will be lost. And so we will get flatter formants if we have a breathy voice, for example. Okay, so the frequency, the peak itself as such is called a formant and has a symbol capital F. Its frequency is the position on the horizontal axis, its level is the height on the vertical axis, its bandwidth is how wide it is, and that's pretty much the properties of formants. So what controls these formants? What is the shape of the vocal tract? And the main articulators are the jaw opening, and the tongue position. But you remember I said whenever you change anything in the voice, everything else changes, so these are not completely independent. They're fairly independent though, so we can do a vowel synthesis just to show the point. So let's do that. We'll bring up our little control panel just to switch over to that. And you heard my voice go down a bit. So here is the synthesizer, and here is the control of the first and second formants, like that. And the first formant is on this axis, so you can hear me going wah. The second formant is on the vertical axis. Fascinating, isn't it? And now, I didn't actually show you the fact that we've added resonances now to the spectrum that we played with before, but I'm out of time, so we can look at that at some other point. I'd like to say though that if you were to learn Swedish, F1 and F2 will not be enough, because while we have maybe, is it 7 or 8 or 9 vowels in English, we have in Swedish 23 or something. And so I will teach you to say fy, fu, fö, få, fe, fi, för, fe, fur. And many of those are actually controlled by the third formant, the lip rounding. Then when we come to the vocal tract length, if I raise my larynx as high as I possibly can, then I will sound like a shorter person, because shorter people will generally have shorter vocal tracts. And if I lower my larynx as far as I can, it sounds like I'm a taller person, because taller persons have longer vocal tracts on the average. And I'm trying now very hard to keep my fundamental frequency the same. So it's not that. So we can hear a lot about a person. We can, as you all know, we can hear not only what a person is saying, but also who is saying to it with quite a high degree of precision. And to this, we also need to add the motor patterns that are very individual, just like walking gait is individual. Our way of moving our tongue and lips and jaw is also very individual and makes the voice personal. So it's a very clever coding scheme. We can code into the spectrum not only the vowel and the consonants, but also the identity of the speaker and many, many other things. And that is one of the marvels of the voice. And with that, I would like to thank you very much.
Hello everybody, I'm Rahul Shristav. Sten's always a hard act to follow, but I'm going to try and package everything Sten got out in the acoustic work and put it back in, except instead of sending it back down the vocal tract, I'm going to put it up the ear and help see how we make sense out of it. So I'm trying to explain here in the next 30 minutes how we go from the acoustic signal, the audio signal, into making some sense about that signal. So what is perception? It's basically two things. It's being aware that there is something, and then making sense of what there is. And they're connected. You can't understand something unless you're aware of it. But one is at a lower level of cognitive load, the other is a more complex operation to draw some meaning out of it. And because we are dealing with speech and voice, it all begins with the ear. And if you're familiar with the ear anatomy, we've got the outer ear. This is the ear canal, all up to the eardrum. You've got a set of 3 tiny little bones, the ear ossicles, which take the vibration from the sound from the eardrum and put it into the cochlea. And the cochlea is where the sound, the audio, the acoustic energy gets converted into little neural impulses. They travel up the 8th nerve, the auditory nerve, up into the brain. And each of these steps alters the acoustic signal as you capture it with a microphone a little bit, and then ultimately the brain makes some sense out of it. So let me just walk you briefly through how or what changes happen and how this process works. So just like the vocal tract is a tube, so is the ear. The outer ear is basically a tube, and the ossicles, the middle ear, is a mechanical system. They're passive, they're not doing anything radically different, but what they're doing is transferring the acoustic energy into the inner ear, and they have a resonance. Just like the vocal tract has a resonance, the outer and the middle ear also has a resonance. So if I hit it and look for a ping or a bong, the ping would look something like this, right around 1500, 2000 hertz to about 4000 hertz is where it's transferring a lot of the energy into the inner ear, and anything above or below that is sort of absorbed or lost by the system. So if you ever had your hearing checked and you go to an audiologist, the audiologist is looking to see if your hearing is showing a notch at 4000 hertz. That's one of the earliest signs of a noise-induced hearing loss. And part of that reason is because that frequency is very close to where your middle and outer ear resonance is. That's where you see the impact very early on. Then it goes to the inner ear, or the cochlea. The cochlea is the snail-like part right here. This part, it's pretty tiny, about the size of the nail of your thumb. And if you cut it open, you see basically 2 canals, and it's spiral, and in a very simplified way, it's got one canal from which the sound enters. It travels all the way up to the top. It goes up through a little hole here and then travels back down through the bottom side or the top side here and comes out of here. The middle membrane is called the basilar membrane, and this is where the magic for sound perception really happens. This is a really interesting membrane. It's really tiny. If you stretch it out, it's about 32 millimeters long, and it has some very weird physical properties. So it's broader at the apex on the top and narrower at the bottom. It's thicker on one side and thinner on the other side. And because it has different physical properties, it has, along its length, different resonant frequencies, which means when the sound travels through it, depending on the frequency of the sound, some parts of the membrane move more than others. So here are some simulations. A low frequency sound would have the maximum vibration on the apex, on the top of it. A low frequency sound, a high frequency sound would have greater vibration on the bottom end of it. So what the basilar membrane is doing is it's taking the complex sound, the voice or the speech or whatever sound you're hearing, and then breaking it apart into different components. Exactly the opposite of what Sten was showing with the sine wave synthesizer. This is actually breaking it. It's an analyzer. It's trying to break the incoming sound into different components. What happens then is, I've kind of simplified this. Let me get here first. In the previous picture, I kind of simplified it, saying there's 2 different tubes with sound going through one and coming out through the other. But in between the two tubes is what's called the organs or Corti, and the basilar membrane is right here at the bottom, and on top of it are these hair cells. about 30,000 of those. And when the basilar membrane moves, there are little hairs, little stereocilia on those cells, they move, and when they move, they fire the neurons underneath it, and so the auditory nerve then is able to get stimulated depending on the frequency that's contained in that sound. So in a very simple way, what the inner ear, what the cochlea is doing, is taking a input sound, whatever that is, and it's breaking it up into different components. So the way we can mathematically represent it is through a series of filters. So each filter corresponds to one tiny little part on the basilar membrane. And I've drawn only about 10 of these, but in reality it's a continuous device, it's a continuous system, so you can have as many as you want. But for practical purposes, you just have a whole bunch of those overlapping with each other. The inner ear, also the stereocilia and the eighth nerve has some other properties that allows us to code sounds into the eighth nerve a little bit differently. One is it's got a non-linear compressive function, which means as the sound energy grows, the amount of intensity that is coded into the signal changes. So at some levels it's coded one way, at another level it's coded another way. It tends to be more selective. At low intensities, the basilar membrane vibration is very narrowly tuned. As the intensity gets louder, as it gets more power in the signal, the movement of the basilar membrane gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So it sort of spreads. The other thing it does is it's what's called phase locking. At low frequencies, the timing of neuron firing gets synchronized. At high frequency, they are kind of firing at random time. The cells can't synchronize with each other. And that helps us with some coding of fundamental frequency or frequency. But between all of these things, the inner ear is a very non-linear system. By non-linear, I mean if I put in one thing, I don't necessarily get the same thing out. I can get something else or something scaled up or down. And just to illustrate, that's your filter bank, right? Here is each different, here are about 10 different filters corresponding to different points in the basilar membrane. Now suppose I input to this ear one frequency, one sine wave at 1000 hertz. The output of the ear now is the output of this channel, which is centered right at 1000 hertz. But it's also a little bit out of this one. It's catching the tail of this filter and a little bit of that little blue filter right here, a tiny amount from this filter, and same thing on the low frequency side. So what I get out of the auditory system into the eighth nerve is something that looks more like this. So it's a non-linear transformation of what's going in. What went into the ear is one frequency, one sine wave. What comes out of the ear is something that's better represented like this. So here's what we are used to seeing. When we do acoustic analysis of voices or speech, we either look at the time waveform, this is how the amplitude changes over time, or a different representation of the same signal, which is frequency versus intensity. This is what Sten was showing. Your fundamental, all your harmonics are those individual spikes, and each of these peaks, that's the first formant right about here, second formant right about here, third, and so on. But we can think about representing this another way. If you're interested in understanding how this is represented in your auditory system and how we make sense out of it, we could think about representing it slightly differently. So we could take the same acoustic spectrum, run it through a filter bank, just like I showed you. I showed it to you with one frequency, and we can put in as many as we want, and we get an output something like this. What you see here is a peak that corresponds to the first harmonic right there, another peak right here, third peak, and then as you go higher in frequency, the peaks sort of disappear. And the reason they disappear is because these filters, if you notice, get wider and wider and wider as you get higher up in frequency. So you can no longer resolve individual harmonics, but you can still understand the general shape of the overall spectrum. Notice also that there are some peaks here. So that's the peak that corresponds to the first formant. That's the peak that corresponds to the second one, and then the third one. We can apply another operation to it to mimic what happens with nonlinear compression cross frequency, and it sort of enhances the same spectrum. So this is called the excitation pattern. It's largely representing what's happening on the basilar membrane, and then you convert it to something called the specific loudness pattern, and that is representing what's happening after the hair cell transduction piece has been completed. Oops, sorry. So the difference between the two, if you notice, is it sort of enhances the peaks. So the difference between the peaks and valleys gets a little bit better. Your formants are a little bit more pronounced. It's also level dependent. The same valve represented at, say, a 50 dB input would look slightly different than a 70, 80, or 90 dB input, because the nonlinear compression of the inner ear affects how these representations are encoded. So if you're interested in understanding the perception or the inner ear representation, this is a better approximation of how the sound is represented rather than this one. This is a better representation of the physical sound, the acoustic signal that's being captured at the microphone. From the cochlea, from the eighth nerve, the auditory signal then travels up the brainstem. It goes through several different nuclei, the cochlear nucleus, the superior auditory complex. There are two pathways, a direct pathway and indirect pathway. It connects to parts like the reticular formation, which sort of is associated with attention, for example, and ultimately makes its way up to the auditory cortex. There are a couple of things to remember here. The most important thing is the tonotopicity. That means the frequency separation of the auditory signal, of the acoustic signal, is maintained throughout. There are some cells that get the high frequency information, other cells that get the low frequency information. So all the way from the cochlea, from the basilar membrane, all the way up to the cortex, that separation is maintained. However, as the signal goes through different parts of the brainstem, there are cells that respond to different parts of the signal. There are some cells that will fire most or get most excited when there's a certain kind of modulation frequency in the spectrum. Other cells that represent or get most exciting, greatest level of excitation when there are certain temporal modulations in the signal. So what's happening is that the same auditory signal is now being expanded. The representation is expanded, so different representations of the same signal are all captured across the auditory pathway somewhere. And then collectively, somehow the brain is piecing that all together to make sense out of it. So once you have that process completed, there are several psychological attributes that you derive out of that representation. There are three basic things for any sound. There's, from a psychophysical perspective, there's the loudness, there's the pitch, there's the quality. There are a couple of the things that are critical for what we deal with, for speech, for song, for voices, and that's the variability. Speech wouldn't work, singing wouldn't work if we are not constantly varying the pitch, the loudness, and quality over time. So the variability in each of these becomes really important to study. And then, of course, there are changes that signal differences involves, or consonants, and that helps us make meaning out of speech. It also helps us do a whole load of other things. The moment you hear somebody talk, you can estimate a person's age, you guess their emotion, you guess sometimes, obviously, their gender. There are lots of other paralinguistic information you extract from the same signal by piecing together all of these components in various ways and matching it to some experience or some template that you have in your head. I'm going to just talk about these three major attributes briefly. Loudness. By definition, loudness is that attribute by which you scale sounds from quiet to loud. So it's pretty easy to understand and define. The key point here is it's related to the total amount of energy, the power or the intensity in the signal. Greater the power, the more energy you put into it, the more loud it gets. But there's also a difference. They are not exactly the same thing. They're very closely related, but they're not exactly the same things. So for example, if I take a simple sound, a pure tone, one sinusoid at 1000 hertz, and then I start playing it out at very, very low levels, and then gradually increase its intensity. And I ask everybody, tell me how loud it is. You will not find that the loudness will not increase equally for every 10 dB increase in intensity. Instead, what you find typically is right around threshold, just when the sound is barely audible, as I increase the intensity, the power, its loudness grows very rapidly. Oops. But as you get higher and higher in intensity, the growth in loudness becomes less and less and less. And this is directly related to that nonlinear compression that happens out in the peripheral auditory system. So if you replace intensity with loudness, you miss out on that curve. It'll look like a straight line. So when you're talking about loudness from a psychophysical perspective, you're talking about what a person feels or what a person perceives. When you're talking about sound pressure, you're talking about the actual power in the sound. There are other things that happen too. So this is what's called the equal loudness contours. If you play two sounds at equal intensity, equal power, they may have different loudness based on their frequencies. So for example, if you follow this curve corresponds to, this says that at about 1000 hertz, the loudness of a tone at 1000 hertz at 50 dB is about the same as that of that tone at 65 dB for 100 hertz. In fact, if you've ever played with an older amplifier and you just increase the volume up, if you're a hobbyist, a lot of times you'll see that by changing the gain, you alter the quality of the sound coming out of the speaker. And that's because some of the simpler, cheaper, older amplifiers, when you increase the gain, they increase the volume of all the harmonics, of the entire spectrum equally. The newer ones are smarter, and so the DSP board in those amplifiers has this logic built in, and so you don't see that very often these days, but find an old amplifier on eBay sometime and play with it, and you'll notice the change pretty easily. By the way, I also have lots of sound files here, which I'm not going to play, largely to conserve time, but also because as these AV systems have gotten more and more sophisticated, a lot of the things that I try to highlight often don't translate in these systems. But if you're ever interested, pull me aside, I'll play it out on my computer over headsets, and you can hear the changes very easily. In speech and in singing, I think both Sten and Johan earlier mentioned, the loudness is largely dominated by what happens on the lower harmonics. The higher harmonics contribute greatly to the perceived quality of the signal, but the loudness itself is dominated by the lower harmonics. That's where the bulk of the acoustic energy is. So if you take a voice and alter the shape of the spectrum, the loudness, the quality can change very easily, but the loudness may or may not change depending on what happens to the low frequencies. So in a nutshell, the take-home message here is loudness is very, very closely related to the sound power, but they're not the same. They're somewhat different, and the loudness of a sound varies on a number of different things. It depends on the intensity, the spectrum, the acoustics of the room, the separation from the source, all kinds of different things. The second thing is pitch. Probably the most fascinating to me perceptual attribute of sounds. Again, pretty easy to define. It's the scale on which you separate sounds from low to high. Again, intuitively, it's very easy for people to understand that. And just like loudness, it's related to frequency or fundamental frequency for complex sounds, but they're not the same things. They're similar in some ways, but pitch is the psychological attribute related to frequency, but they're not exactly the same thing. So just as we did with loudness, if I take a tone, keep increasing its fundamental frequency or frequency for a sine wave, and ask people how high is the pitch, the change is not a linear line. In fact, it's a function very much like the loudness curve. It grows rapidly at some point, and then it gets compressed, and that leads to a scale called Mel scale. Some of you may have heard of it. There are other variants of this, which each one has been refined a little bit over the years, and that's a better correspondence for pitch of simple sinusoidal waves. Complex waves have more complexity in pitch estimation. For speech, which is a complex signal, it's largely related to the fundamental frequency. Again, Sten gave some good examples of that. It's related to the separation between the harmonics, which are multiples of the bass, so much so that I can take a complex signal, this is just me saying ah, and I can remove the fundamental from this one, and the pitch will sound almost identical. There's a difference in the quality of the sound, but the pitch sounds very similar. I'll play this out. This usually works, but let's see. So you'll hear the top one first and the bottom one second. That wasn't me saying I apologize, but it's just a complex series, and you can hear one with the lowermost fundamental. For complex signals, for speech, for example, there's a difference between the frequency perceived for a sine wave versus that for a complex wave with the same fundamental frequency. For fundamental frequencies below about 1,000 hertz, a complex sound with the same fundamental as a pure tone would have a perceived pitch which is slightly lower than the pure tone. So again, sometimes depending on what you're studying or what you're reading, that may be a difference you want to be aware of. It's not easy to compare the pure tone frequency pitch to that of a complex tone without addressing some correction to it. But this is why it gets really exciting. As I mentioned, pitch is so fundamental to auditory perception of sound. It helps you decode emotions in speech. It helps you understand speaker identity. It helps you in a noisy situation focus on one talker instead of another talker. Pitch is that most prominent perceptual attribute that you are really zeroing into to make all kinds of judgments about a signal. The variation in pitch is equally important. For very, very slow modulations, that's what leads to intonation and melody. That's what's used to signal, emphasis versus a statement versus a question. For example, I could say Bob hit Bill or Bob hit Bill. It's largely in the intonation pattern, but what's happening there is the pitch changes are very, very slow. At medium ranges, you get something like vibrato. They add a certain distinct quality characteristic to it. For people with certain diseases like Parkinson's, it's also tremor. You don't necessarily hear the slow modulation, but you can hear the change because of that slightly more rapid fluctuation in pitch. And at very, very high modulations, your ears cannot really separate it from the voice itself. So it has a qualitative attribute to it, but it's very difficult to separate the modulation in pitch from the bass pitch itself. So all of these three things and these things together sometimes help your brain make some judgments, some awareness, and some attributes of what you're hearing. For music, it's really critical. I don't have to explain it to this audience. And from a psychophysical perspective, pitch is really a three-dimensional component. There's the pitch height. That's what, when we talk about pitch being related to frequency, what we're really talking about is pitch height. It's the difference between a high pitch sound and the low pitch sound. It's the difference in the frequency itself. But then there is the pitch chroma. This is that attribute of pitch along which the notes of a musical scale tend to repeat every octave. And then there's a third component, which is the pitch strength. And that is sort of the degree of tonality in a sound. How strong is the pitch sensation? So if I have two notes, say the same musical note, one out of, say, a stringed instrument, and let's say a piano and a flute, they may have the same pitch, maybe even the same pitch chroma, but one could have a much higher pitch strength. It's more salient pitch. The other has a lower pitch strength, and that's sort of the flute. A wind instrument will have a lower pitch strength. You could take an extreme example. You can take a sine wave, which is here in green. It's a signal with just one frequency. Or you can take a noise, which is centered around that frequency. So it's a noise. I've kind of filtered it with some cutoff. What you'll hear if you listen to these two signals is they have about the same pitch, but the difference is in the pitch strength. One has a very strong sense of tonality, the other one has a very weak sense of tonality. So here are the two. So, you know, those are the three distinct, from a psychological perspective, three different attributes of pitch. It's not just one thing, but three different psychological attributes. In fact, there are papers showing that different cells into different parts of the brain sort of respond to differences in these three psychological attributes of pitch. This is really interesting in voice analysis too, pitch strength in particular, because you know, voices which have a clear harmonic pattern, and others which have very little harmonics, sometimes you can separate them on the basis of pitch strength. Even if they have very similar pitch, you can separate them using pitch strength. So as Sten mentioned, a lot of the voice analysis work is done trying to characterize the audio signal, but you could also do the same thing from a perceptual standpoint, and some things which are very difficult to do on the acoustic signals are much easier to do on the auditory internal representation of the acoustic signals. So key takeaway points for pitch is it's related to frequency or fundamental frequency, but remember they're not the same things. They are very, very different. One is talking about the physical component, the physical part of the acoustic energy. The other is talking about how that is represented, and we make some sense out of it in your heads. It varies with a whole host of factors, level, frequency, the shape of the spectrum, and things like that. The third thing is quality, and the quality is essentially defined by what it is not. If two sounds are identical in pitch and loudness, then everything that separates them is quality. It's largely related to two things, the how it changes over time, or how it changes in its spectrum. In the world of sound quality, there are two major components: roughness, which is largely related to temporal changes, and sharpness, which is related to the spectral shape. In the voice world, in the dysphonic and music world, there are hundreds, literally hundreds of terms used to describe them. Some you're more familiar with, which are related primarily to the vocal source, others related to the vocal tract. But again, just to reinforce what Sten said earlier, when one thing changes, everything else changes as well. So they're not absolutely independent of each other. There are a whole host of measures used to describe changes in the acoustic signal. There are literally probably thousands of papers trying to correlate these with what people perceive. But remember, all of these measures are representations of the signal. They're not necessarily representations of how we hear the signals. They are correlated, but they are not always one-on-one. There are issues around sensitivity and specificity of these. And more recently, people have attempted to combine various signals to get some better approximation of changes in quality. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to quickly move through one other thing that I think is critical for you to keep in mind as you listen to papers or do your own research or present your research over the next few years. When it comes to perception, unlike the vocal fold vibration or air pressure or audio signals, you really cannot measure it directly. There's no device you can put in somebody's head and get an estimate of a perception directly. Instead, you're always asking people to tell you what you think. When I say what's the pitch of sound of a given sound or the quality of a sound, I'm asking you, you tell me what do you think it is, which means you've got an additional layer of complexity in any kind of perceptual measurement. These are some of the common ways of measuring it, but all of these are impacted by a whole bunch of biases. I just want to give you examples of some. So suppose I give you a bunch of squares and I say, rate the size of these squares on a scale of 1 to 7. 1 is the smallest and 7 is the biggest. Right? Very similar to what you do for a voice quality experiment, for example. So suppose half this room gets this series. You get this, and then this one, and this one, and then this one, and then that one. Another half, the ones on my left, get a different series. And you both ask the same thing, scale it from 1 to 7. What will always happen is that the last square, notice these two are identical in size, but the group on my right will invariably give this a larger number than the group on the left. Why? Because what you say here is biased by what you just heard before it. It's relative to something else that's out there. It's relative to your experience or what you've heard in your immediate past. So when a person says this quality is a 4 on a scale of 7, that's what they hear plus what their biases are. Here's another example. Let's say somebody gets this series and they say the first one's 2, next one's bigger, so you say 3, and then say 4, and then you say 5. Another person, for whatever reason, starts by 3. So then you have to say 4, 5, and 6. Now you've got an offset. The numbers are always different. But does that mean they perceive these differently? Not necessarily. What that means is that their numbering system is different. So anytime you're studying perception of anything, you have to separate what's happening from the biases that come in the measurement. So when you do this work, whether it's in the clinic, whether it's in the research, you have to be very cognizant of how these measurement schemes will impact your end results. Here's an interesting component. If I ask you, how long is this line? What would you say? That's one way. Any other guesses? See, the difference here is you're not using a scale of 1 to 7. You're saying it's 4 feet or 2 meters or whatever it is. The reason here is we all know what a foot is or what a meter is. There is a familiar unit and you are making measurements like length relative to that familiar unit. When we talk about something like quality, there is no familiar unit. Doesn't mean we can't create it, but as of now, there isn't one that's widely accepted. So for some measurements, you can convert it to a physical, some sort of a yardstick, and do measurements in some standard metrics, which eliminates some of these errors and biases that come in. There are different kinds of information you get from measurement schemes. When you get ratings, you get what's ordinal. Typically, what it says is, this voice is bigger than that one, this voice is bigger than that one, or louder, or higher in pitch, or more hoarse, whatever you're measuring. But it does not tell you how much bigger is this than that. Another measurement property is called an interval scale, what's called equal appearing intervals. This would be true if your measurement then says that if this is 1, this is 4 units bigger, and this is 5 units bigger. Remember, they're the same sizes as this one. But if you call them 1, 2, 3, you're just getting ordinal information. If you're getting 1, 4, and 5, this could be equal appearing intervals. You could also get equal ratios. This is a scale where you get, this is a base unit, this is twice as big, this is 2.5 times as big, you could get 10 times as big. Some things, some perceptual attributes are better quantified using ratio measurements rather than equidistant measurements. Most psychophysical ones tend to be better served this way. Here's an attribute. We've used this in our lab in experiments to get away from that number assignment biases. I'll do a signal where we say, if you're measuring breathiness, for example, we have the subject listen to a voice saying, ah, and then we have another signal where we can artificially manipulate the breathiness up and down using some experimental paradigm. And the subjects in our experiments would move that measurement stimulus up and down till they say, okay, now the breathiness of this matches the breathiness of that. So now I've gotten rid of that number assignment, and by doing that, we've gotten rid of a lot of those biases. So there are different ways of measuring perception. Some are simpler, some are more complicated, but depending on the study design, you get different information. But the key point to remember is, no matter what you do, you cannot separate the head and the biases. There's no direct way of measuring it, so you always have to be cognizant of that part. I'll skip this part, just run to the summary. Just remember, when it comes to perception, the acoustic signal has a non-linear representation in the auditory pathways, and that is critical to understand how we make sense out of signals. What we perceive is a complex interaction of many different processes and attributes of the signal. Major components are pitch, loudness, and quality. They are different from frequency, intensity, and the gobs of measurements we talk about for defining quality. And then different types of measurement schemes give you different kinds of information. Thank you.
Come after the Smarty Smart Pants. And I just am so humbled and learning so much every time I come to the tutorial. It's a little bit of a gauge of where I am on the journey. I remember coming as a very young faculty member and scrambling to keep up, and it's nice to not have to scramble quite as much. But if you're like me, you probably would like to move around a little bit, so as I go through the introductory materials here, if anybody would like to stand and stretch and use elasticity and all the things we're talking about, I really invite you to do that. We're going to be talking about things that we balance in the voice studio, really how you work with the student in front of you and what priorities you might have. What I need to know to be an effective singing teacher, much of the things we've covered this afternoon, but a whole list beyond that as well. And why students might seek out somebody like a voice teacher. So I like to start, not only because this is very attractive to look at, but it reminds me that we need to have a lot of balance in what goes on. And in pedagogy classes, we would have a conversation about this, what sorts of things you need to have balanced with your students. But one thing that comes to mind, of course, is alignment. Of course, this is the muscles of breathing in and breathing out, but it's also just the way you align the body. And what that does for a student can sometimes be very powerful, and if it's out of balance, of course, is what we need to be looking at. Phonation, we all want balanced phonation and registration, so we're looking at, use your term of preference, head voice, chest voice, TACT, mode 1, mode 2, etc. But ensure that that voice is lined up and balanced. Their placement. Is the placement clear, brilliant? Is it warm and round? Always looking for that balanced chiaroscuro. We're balancing long-term and short-term goals. So our students always have the audition day after tomorrow, but what about that long-term goal? Is that a degree recital? Is that a role they're preparing? We're balancing the technical work, those very minute adjustments to get the best vocalism, and artistry. Because if we leave one of those elements out, we're just probably not finding the most balanced student we can. Repertoire, we'll come back to this, but this whole idea of time periods, regardless of what genre you're in, you want to study the classics, in your field, you want to study things that are very current, and kind of getting a continuum there, really getting a sense of a breadth of the repertoire and the style. And if I was in a classical genre, I'd want to be looking at the different languages. So are the students conversant in art song and opera and oratorio and chamber music? And is that only in one language, or is this many languages? So it can be quite something to balance. Likewise, we need uptunes, we need ballads, and this is also a way to be sure that the voice is flexible and the voice sustains well. And both of those bring in a very different kind of balance as well. But we go back to the simple, and we think just like good triage, what is the priority? For some students, it might be memorizing a song for a jury, for a recital. For other students, it might be passing a math test so they can actually graduate. Some students, it might be releasing shoulder tensions that are impeding the technique. And for a new freshman I had this year, the priority was working on musicianship. She sings beautifully with a very balanced tone, but counting rhythm and finding intervals for her is daunting, and she needs help, and I'm there to help her with that. So, things I need to know to be an effective singing teacher. Voice technique goes without saying, but this whole idea of anatomy, function, articulation, registration, resonance, acoustics, many of the things we were learning about this afternoon, this is a life's work. And some people, when you read the blogs, when you read articles, you see that sometimes you can get very focused in on one aspect of some of this list. And I will just encourage us all to think about balance, to think about things beyond, like maybe repertoire and vocalises. So this who, what, where, when, why sort of thing. What repertoire would I choose for a certain student and why? And when in their development? And how are they going to go about interpreting that? I'm thinking about the artists coming in this week, Mignon Dunn and Julianne Baird, and they probably sing a very different kind of repertoire for good reason, but I wonder if along the way maybe they studied the same piece, and they wouldn't have done it the same way. And it's kind of important for us to bear that in mind. With vocalises, I might think, when does that vocalise come? Is it the first thing in the lesson? Is it a little later when the voice is more flexible? Is it a little later when the singer is more developed? And where in the range do you do it? And how do you do it? And what are you trying to get out of that? So being very mindful about the sorts of materials you ask the students to work on. I need to know about lyric diction. So the International Phonetic Alphabet is my friend. And I need to know standard pronunciation. So if I'm singing an English art song, I want to have a very standard lyric diction. But if I'm singing something in the vernacular, if I'm in a contemporary music theater song, or even singing something like Oh, What a Beautiful Morning from Oklahoma, I would be looking at maybe vernacular or dialects, or thinking about My Fair Lady and somebody needing to be in a Cockney accent, and it is also a very large thing we need to bear in mind. Language and poetry. We sing words, and we usually sing very beautiful words. I was lucky in middle school to have a poetry teacher who opened my eyes to all sorts of things, and I don't take that for granted because I see my students coming in not always knowing that, not always realizing what sorts of imagery and poetry they can really hold on to. And so sometimes we'll be talking about these sorts of things. Sometimes we need to look at the syntax to know where to breathe. If there's no punctuation, well, let's look at a prepositional phrase and maybe not choose that as the place to breathe. So always working on our skills in this area helps very much. Our students, I don't need to be their acting coach, I don't need to stage their aria, but I certainly do need to maybe give some initial skills to people. help them with their communicating of this very grand lyric we have. Movement concepts. I know some of the people in the room do some of these things, and I admire them greatly. But I might see a student who needs additional body work than I can provide. And so me knowing what these other fields are helps me direct them to their best use. Piano. Don't even get the voice teachers started talking about needing to know the piano. Vocalizing, sitting down and being able to really facilitate that at the keyboard. But more and more, we need to be working on repertoire with students as well. You see it in the job postings. Piano skills are really something that people are desiring of studio teachers. And all the time spent there is time well spent to help students. I need to know music theory and musicianship, otherwise I can't help my freshmen who came in and couldn't count. So I need to keep developing those skills in myself as well. Music history and stylistic context, it always comes into play. Again, it goes back to the repertoire with the different time periods and the genres, but also just knowing what would be stylistic for that. Which leads to performance practice. And knowing the great singers of the past and the shoulders that we stand upon goes a long way to being able to help. What are those performance expectations going to be? This man holding his score, obviously singing oratorio. If I didn't know that, I could not prepare my students quite as well. Methods, I could spend the entire day talking here. It certainly incorporates learning styles, and there's a slide there. It's very small, sorry about that. But more than just the learning styles of the student, it might be the various ways I have to deliver information. So, for instance, do I do it mechanistically? Do I explain the exactitude of what we want to do, or do I demonstrate it? Or do we use imagery? Or maybe I pick a song that is actually going to make them need to do that little element we're working on. So the composer's our friend, and he actually helps the student learn and practice that thing. Sometimes they just need inspiration. Sometimes they just need an opportunity to find that muscle balance, and it's good to be their cheerleader. Of course, we could have a conversation to touch or not to touch. This is something big in our field as well, so being mindful of all of these things. Which leads to psychology. It is important to be able to read that student and know when to maybe lean in and expect a little more, and when that's not appropriate. I need to know what materials I need and how to run my studio, particularly if this is an independent studio. And of course, knowing when and where to refer. We have a great responsibility to the vocal health of our students. In addition to providing guidance for improving technique, many teachers are proactive in terms of vocal hygiene, with advice about things like hydration, vocal load, lifestyle, reflux, stress management. I don't want to be doing something outside my area of expertise, but I do want to pass on the information that I know. In university, like Penn State, we're often dealing with students who are away from home for the first time and maybe experiencing freedoms that they need to find a balance with. Sometimes there's inadequate sleep because they're in a noisy dorm. And when cold and flu season hits, the university is like a giant petri dish. It just is. But when an issue arises that doesn't seem to be part of a regular illness or a seasonal allergy, doesn't seem to respond to rest or technical adjustment, it's time to ask for help. And the Hershey medical school as part of Penn State. It's a ways away, but I knew it was important to get in the car with a colleague and go over there and meet the folks and let them know us and what we're up to and vice versa. And being able to reach out to them when we have students in need is such a great comfort to us. And they're happy to help, as all the people in the room are happy to help, but getting to know them and knowing when and where to refer, extremely part of the balance. Goes without saying because you're here, but knowing about this has been huge for me. It's the network. Sometimes you can feel like you're in the trenches, but the network can also often be a way to provide opportunities for students as well. Current events and the profession, things do change over time, and it's important to stay abreast of that. For instance, a number of my students who are auditioning for young artist programs, back in the day they didn't need to have a music theater piece, it was just their standard package of 5 arias. Well, now they need a music theater piece and they need a monologue, and things are changing, and you want to be sure to have your students as well prepared as they can be for what's to come. So, we could go on and on. Something to consider is the developmental changes across the lifespan. That's something we certainly need to know about. And like physicians, not all voice teachers are generalists. Many focus on a particular specialty. It might be a certain type of repertoire, a style of singing, a particular technical issue. Richard Miller, in his great book, The Structure of Singing, warned of teachers who were unbalanced, though. This technique mystique, the one who just let you know what you needed to know, it kept you coming back with a lot of mystery around it. Or instructors who just work on one aspect, for instance. We're always looking for balance. So we go back to it. Why students might seek out a voice teacher. Chances are they're all preparing for auditions of some sort. So it might be a college program. I had many independent students who were auditioning for college programs. They would come to the house and we would work on that. And then after college, they're looking at young artist programs. Maybe one of the high school students is trying to get into the top choir at ensemble. Maybe they're auditioning for a show. Could be something else. But they probably come with material they want to be working on. If they're not preparing for audition, maybe it's because they're already performing in one of these. So the students I work with at Penn State are in their college program, and when they go off to young artist programs, chances are they're going to be voice faculty there who are going to be coaching them along the way, etc. Maybe those private students come because they want to work on a certain area to build their confidence. It could be any of these sorts of things. Be happy to talk with you about individual students and the sorts of things they've been wanting to work on, but it's just a kind of great honor to meet them right where their goals are. And I don't think I mentioned it at the beginning, but it certainly is huge, finding out the goals of the students, because it influences all those things. They might come because they just like to sing, because those lessons are just a part of their week that is something great. They also might come because they are rehabilitating, and we as informed instructors can be part of that team of care. And it could be something else as well. So, without further ado, I think we're at our Q&A. I think I may have even made up on it.
Now, the speakers, please.